The concept behind this conversion is an Orruk warband dedicated to killing Stormcast, and looting their armor and weapons and strapping it to themselves. Looting enemy equipment is a common theme among 40k orcs, so why not the Ironjaws? I started with this Orruk brute who has a built-in Ironjaw. For what I had planned, this would make it easier as that aspect wouldn't be connected to his chest plate. This is one of the greaves liberated from a Stormcast liberator. To get it to fit over the greaves of the brute, I cut down the original ones. The Stormcast legs are longer than the brute ones, so to get it to fit in place, I had to carve into the bottom before gluing it. It's not a perfect fit, but that's sort of the idea, that it's been strapped over his existing armor, and I planned on going in later and sculpting straps with green stuff. For the chest, I did the same thing. I snipped down the inside of a Stormcast breastplate, some of the brute's chest, and glued it in place. Ditto for the armored skirt. The arms were where it got complicated. While it would have been easiest just to slap on a pair of normal brute arms, I liked the stance of this Stormcast pair. This somehow mutated into this mishmash of brute and Stormcast parts. I'm skipping over it because after adding a slashed up pauldron and a cracked shield, I realized I hated how the brute was turning out. It just looked goofy and dumb to me. After puzzling it over for a bit, I realized the problem was that I had slapped on too many Stormcast parts without an eye to how they fit together as a whole. So I decided to start over with a more restrained approach. This time for the breastplate, I chose this one from a Stormcast Annihilator. It's larger than the other, which would help the fit. To achieve that fit though, I snipped off the armored skirt and the front half of the pauldrons. I cut into the brute's chest again and glued the breastplate into place. I slid in a plasticard sheet at the waist to give the brute a bit more height so the breastplate wouldn't clip into the brute's armored skirt. For his weapons, I snipped off the end of his spear so I could replace it with this. This is the hammer from the Steelheart Champions kit that I modified a while ago for a different project with crude spikes. It felt very Orruk-y to me to defile a Stormcast weapon to make it more killy. I drilled into the shaft of the hammer, then pinned it in place. I glued his left arm at a lower angle than it was meant to be and hid any awkwardness with this torn up Stormcast pauldron positioned upside down. This is an armor plate I harvested from one of the newer Stormcast sets. I glued one to his right hip and another longer one to his left. I harvested more armor plates and positioned them around my brute's left arm as though he simply kept strapping them on. To enhance the strapped on aspect, I cut divots into the brute's bracer, then looped this chain around the forearm in a process that would have been significantly easier to do before I attached the arm. Despite the difficulty, it's one of my favorite touches on the model, really emphasizing my brute's looted Stormcast aesthetic. I decided to leave the right arm of the brute largely unarmored. I liked the asymmetric look, though his arm is a bit reedy. For my next brute, I started by recreating the same armor as on my last brute, a mix of Annihilator breastplate and other armor plates around the waist. I've always really liked this claw thing the brute kit comes with and thought it would make a good contrast with the Stormcast armor. As I looked at it though, the idea occurred to me to replace the claw portion with this hacked up Stormcast shield. I'd cut it into a claw crescent, careful not to scrape off too much of the raised decoration so it'd still be recognizable as Stormcast when painted. Attaching it was pretty simple. I popped off the claw, then glued the shield in its place, leaving the original pincer gripped in his fist. I sculpted green stuff straps, then used a glob of green stuff to attach another broken shield as a pauldron. I liked the idea of an even more asymmetric look than my last brute, the claw arm even more heavily armored. For his weapon, I was originally going to give him a modified Stormcast weapon like my previous brute, but that felt like it was a little much. What I noticed is that too many repurposed armor or weapons on my brutes made them look less like dedicated Stormcast killers and more like scavengers or kleptomaniac hermit crabs. At this point, I made the rough rule that they should only have one major piece of Stormcast armor and one Stormcast weapon. Minor plates are fine since they tend to look like trophies. I kind of messed that up with my first two brutes, so to hide the Stormcast breastplate and de-emphasize it a bit, I glued on an armor plate from the War Chanter kit to his shoulder as a half-iron jaw. I liked this axe for my brute, but as I was looking through brute arms, I stumbled on this decapitated head one. I love the idea he's just cut it clean from an enemy's shoulders, blood still on his claw. The head doesn't look particularly Stormcast though, so I snipped it off under the hair, picked the Stormcast helm, then pinned it to the hand so it looked like the hair had been a crest. For my previous two brutes, I kept the normal brute bottom half and switched the breastplate to Stormcast ones. For this brute, I decided to reverse that by giving him the armor plates and scale skirt from a Stormcast Praetor. None of them quite fit out of the box, so I carefully sliced the armor plates from the other two elements so I could reposition them at a different angle. To their right, I added another set of armor plates harvested from the Praetor kit and a Stormcast head with the back clipped off to hang from the belt like a trophy. With the bottom half fully kitted out in Stormcast fashion, I sculpted green stuff as muscle to my brute and gave him a left arm so he could heft a Stormcast shield. A modified one, of course. These spikes are from an ogre gut plate which I snipped off and glued to the shield to look like they'd been nailed on. It helps sell the idea that the brutes aren't just orcs with Stormcast armor, but actively looting and modifying the armor they find for their own needs. Before I attached it though, I paired up side by side this brute and the previous one minus their arms and weapons. Something about the pose and bull chest of the previous brute seemed to match the idea of a spiked shield a lot more than the crab claw. He's just more menacing looking with it, shield and axe held out like he's barely constraining his rage. To fill out his silhouette even more, I glued on a reverse Stormcast pauldron instead of the half shield I had originally. Conversely, the trophy hand and crab claw fit my third brute a lot better than the axe and shield had, something kind of creepy incrustation about them in his hands. For brute number 4, I was inspired by this Stormcast longsword. While swapping Stormcast and Orruk arms had been an utter mess on my first try, I thought I might be able to make it work on a second attempt. As I mentioned then, the Stormcast arms aren't terribly sized for a brute, but the hands are really tiny. Instead of trying to mishmash them together with brute parts though, I instead took some brute arms and used entirely too much green stuff to give them roughly the same pose as the Stormcast ones. This may look rough, but I wasn't actually worried about how the flesh of the arms would look, as I planned on covering them entirely with Stormcast armor. Because of the close pose of the arms, this brute was going to have to forego any kind of chest plate I thought, though later I did end up adding one underneath. Using a pin vise, a lot of drilling, and a paperclip, I created a handle for the hands to clasp around. One of the nice things about doing it this way was that they could still rotate around the handle for easier positioning on the brute. It took a lot of fiddling to get the pose I wanted to look right. The initial fit had the sword too close to the midline of the model, so I snapped off the left arm and carved into the chest so it could be positioned wrapping around farther. Eventually, I got a pose that felt natural. I took off the arms and applied some Stormcast armor. In this case, that meant a pair of knee guards and hip plates. Subtle, but they really helped pull the model together. What was not subtle was all the Stormcast armor I plastered on the brute's arms. I'll spare you the vast amount of fiddling that came along with figuring out the best fitting pattern. The result is undeniably cool though. It has a really knightly look to it thanks to the circle things on the inside of the elbows, like this brute was some kind of demented Lancelot. The last wrinkle to iron out was the brute's weapon. The Stormcast sword I had him grasping felt a little too thin and toothpicky, so I replaced it with a resin-casted one. While that helped broaden the blade, it was now also far too tall. This being the weapon of a brute, I simply snapped the blade about half in length at a diagonal to make it look like the sword had been shattered in two at some point. I scored cuts in the blade to really sell the idea. For my final brute, I somehow lost a lot of his footage. The basic idea was to combine a brute body with the arms from an orc knob and use Stormcast armor to again hide the wonkiness of the arms. I paired this body with the same arms years ago for an orc build and always really liked the composition. It has a really great crouching look to it. To armor the arms, I used the lessons I learned with my last brute, but used enlarged bracers for pauldrons. I also used this enormous banner because I liked how ridiculous it looked. And with that, my Stormcast brutes were ready for battle. In all, I'm really pleased with them, though a few elements are still a bit wonky. I couldn't quite figure out how to work in iron jaws for any of them, and the bare arms on the first brute still feel a bit undersized. But on the whole, they were an incredibly fun experiment. If you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe, or check out some of my other conversions. Thanks for watching.